The following story contains sound effects that may be alarming to some listeners, and so may not be sleep-friendly. When I was 8, I went on a camping trip with my scouts group to some mountains in County Offaly, Ireland. The plan was to be dropped off by bus, hike through the mountains, and set up camp at a wooden cabin. A straightforward plan, with the promise of good food and stories awaiting us. If only things had turned out as planned. If only I went home with the kind of story that I wouldn't have wanted to hide for 22 years. It had taken me that long to finally tell the story of what happened to me there. The memories had been buried in the back of my mind for so long, lost to the fog and trees of those black mountain valleys. We arrived at the car park, all chatter and excitement, having been cooped up on the bus for the past few hours. As relieved as I was to stretch my legs, the prospect of the trip ahead of me filled me with dread. See, I wasn't the kind to be drawn to trips like this, nor was I even drawn to the Scouts to begin with. My parents had pushed me to join, in a bid to get me out of my comfort zone and hopefully shake off the incessant anxiety that had plagued me ever since I had moved school. I was quiet, my humour offbeat and my interests unusual, at least by the standards of my classmates. They were unusual enough for me to be ostracised most of the time. All I wanted was to talk about horror movies and video games, while my classmates wanted to talk about hurling and football. I wasn't even that different from them, I just liked things they didn't. Those differences, it seemed, were more than enough to justify years of wordless rejection, dirty looks and poorly hidden smirks when I so much as opened my mouth. It didn't help my sense of dread that my most overt enemy was present on the trip. Jake Kerrigan, the class clown, running his mouth and dragging everyone's attention to him, as usual. And of course the only one who could keep him in line was his father, the camp counsellor. Counsellor Kerrigan was a kind man, to be fair, attentive and soft-spoken, doting on Jake and his younger sister Breda. I had thought of telling him how his son was treating me, but I struggled to speak to anyone, let alone to make a complaint, and one about their own son at that. With my one and only friend in the class being absent for the trip with a stomach bug, I resorted to my tried and true tactic of turtling up, keeping quiet, and getting on with things while being as small a target as possible. We were greeted by Councillor Murphy from the Offaly Scouts, who knew the area well and was due to lead us to the cabin. She called us to gather together and do an inventory check and go over some rules before setting out. As we grouped together, a sudden pang of foul odour struck me. It was hard to describe the odour, but an image sprung to mind of a dead fox I had seen on a country road, decay wafting into the air heated by the sun-cooked tarmac. "Smell that fresh country air," Councillor Murphy said with a bubbly clap of her hands. "Lots of animals around here, so don't mind the smell, you'll get used to it in no time. Now if you stick together and follow me and Councillor Kerrigan, we'll be at the cabin in around 45 minutes. Last one there has to set up the bonfire." I'll be last, so, I thought. I'll be glad for something to do. As we walked, I took in my surroundings. Huge dark trees blanketed the mountains, running deep and dark as far as I could see. We had only been walking for 10 minutes, and already I felt as if I were traipsing into a different world. It would have been the perfect escape from my dreadful day today, had it not been for the bad company. That, and the smell. I kept smelling it, and every time I did, I was filled with a horrible feeling that something bad would happen. I was no stranger to this feeling, being the anxious child that I was. I'm sure many people can relate to that implacable feeling of dread, that something bad will happen soon, though it rarely ever does. This feeling was different. It was more of a certainty, rooted into the pit in my stomach, as surely as these woods were rooted into the mountains. Something felt wrong, and sure as hell smelled wrong. Where before I just felt dread, I was now genuinely afraid. Instinct urged me to feign sickness, to ask to turn back while there was still time and retreat to the sanctuary of home. And like I always did when afraid, I kept my mouth shut and marched ever onward. We arrived within the hour, though it felt much longer. In between watching the trees and fighting my horrible fear, I was of course tormented by Jake whenever his attention span lingered on me long enough for him to remember that I exist. I was sure to linger behind, but to no avail. Some of the louder kids wanted to help build the bonfire, and quickly set about doing so. I had either been forgotten to be recruited to build it, or was never noticed at all. Either way suited me fine. I set up my sleeping bag in the most inconspicuous corner of the cabin that I could find. The rest of the day passed in a cold, dull blur. The air was bitingly cold, still and silent, save for the ambient buzz of all present. I reckon I could have enjoyed the trip if I had good company, someone I could be comfortable around and enjoy myself in the nature with. But knowing what I went through next, I'm just glad my real friends weren't with me. I lingered on the periphery of the group, keeping to myself and daydreaming in a bid to pass the time quicker. Every now and then, I felt watched. I looked up, expecting to see Jake prepare some sly remark or stupid joke. As I looked around me, I would inevitably see Councillor Murphy watching me with a wide grin on her face. I was used to feeling invisible. Being watched by her made me uneasy for some reason. Logically, I knew that having an adult look out for me and wanting me to be at ease must surely be a good thing, but her smile just seemed off somehow. I was conflicted between unease and appreciation at the fact that I actually felt seen for once. As night fell, excitement began to build for the imminent bonfire. The kindling ignited as the last of the sun faded beyond the trees and gloom, and the world was painted blue and orange. It was my hope that ghost stories would be told. What kind of scout councillors would have a bonfire and not tell at least one? To my dismay, they performed an improv comedy act about, of all things, a football match. Even here I could not escape the sports-centric mediocrity of my school. They soon disbanded. A hike through the dark woods had been planned after the bonfire. All decided to go, except for me. My parents saw fit to equip me only with an old bulb flashlight, the battery of which was almost dead. Dying along with it was my social battery, so if staying behind allowed me even half an hour to myself, I would take it. Councillor Kerrigan took the group, while Councillor Murphy stayed behind. As I resigned myself to moping indoors, wishing I was home playing video games, Councillor Murphy approached me. God, that bonfire was shocking, wasn't it? Not even a single ghost story. Never thought I'd see the like. I gave a meek laugh in response, wholeheartedly agreeing, but not having the confidence to carry the conversation. Would you have liked one yourself? She asked, seeking to bring me out of my shell. Yeah, I stammered. Well, I happen to know a place just up the road that makes for a great spot to tell a good ghost story. How about we go tell one before everyone gets back? I'll bring the marshmallows and hot chocolate. I didn't really want to go, but the idea of having at least some reprieve from the monotony with something I genuinely enjoyed enticed me. That, and food, was one of the few comforts I had back then. An adult who was supposed to protect me offering me food and a good ghost story? I should have known it was too nice. We walked up the road we had arrived from earlier, a steep incline covered in sharp stones leading up to the tree line. Out here, away from the dying light of the bonfire, it was almost complete blackness. I expected to hear the distant laughs of the group, but all was silent except for the sound of my breathing as we ascended. We walked into the woods, avoiding boggy puddles of muck. My light barely illuminated the best way forward, but Councillor Murphy's LED lantern cast enough light to guide us properly. We arrived at a small clearing. I expected some sort of organised space, log benches or a campfire or something, but all I saw was a bare clearing with some rocks that barely passed for seating. Councillor Murphy sat and invitingly patted a rock as if it were the height of luxury, with a wide grin on her face. Her face was illuminated from a low angle by the pale blue light of the lantern, and her smile sent chills down my back more than the bitter winter night air did. It was even more off-putting up close. She handed me a pack of marshmallows and a thermos of hot chocolate. I dropped some marshmallows into the thermos and sat down, unnerved but excited. I took a deep breath. Cold alpine air, winter fresh, mixed with steaming hot chocolate and that fucking awful smell from earlier. I gagged, my appetite dissipating with the thermos's steam in the night air. It was worse than earlier, permeating the air like rancid meat on a summer's day. My memories of the time aren't perfect. Most of what I'm telling you now passed by in a sort of half-remembered blur, with certain moments holding it all together. For that reason I can't fully recall the story she told. It didn't matter anyway, as it was all just a lure. I wasn't to be told a ghost story. I was in one. As she told the story of unmapped caves, missing children, and mound people, her eyes never faltered once. I don't recall her blinking, nor dropping that damnable smile once. The smell only got worse as she spoke. I tried to cover my nose, but it made little difference. The lantern she had set down on a rock had begun to fade. I only noticed as it happened so subtly, my eyes had had time to adjust, like being in a room as the sun sets. I had noticed too late. The light went out. I recall the next moments the most vividly, though they passed by in a blur. A brief few seconds of silence, blackness, and nauseating stink. I remember the faintest wisp of white in the blackness as my hyperventilated breath tumbled forth in a waft of fog. I fumbled for my flashlight, true fear and freezing cold numbing my hands and clouding my sensibilities far worse than any of my beloved horror movies could ever have prepared me for. My thumb found the button on my light. My light turned on, and there, illuminated in flickering yellow light, stood something that wasn't Councillor Murphy anymore. A sinuous body of pale, undulating flesh, caked with forest soil. Ragged black hair, curtaining teeth as rotten as tree pith and just as old. Too many fingers, too many joints. The stink of something fermented in the bowels of the earth and expelled for being too fetid. My body took over, instinct sending my legs pumping where fear and innocence would have me remain rooted to the spot. I recall warm breath on my ear and the snap of teeth, agonized moans as if the thing's very existence weighed painfully on its too numerous joints. In my panic to escape, I forgot the puddles of muck near the tree line. My foot plunged into one, sinking deep. I was ensnared, tugging desperately as the thuds of misshapen hands and feet drew closer. I pulled forth my foot, leaving my shoe submerged. I managed to tumble down the mucky slope onto the road, stray thorns and bramble cutting at my palms and face. Sharp stones stung my exposed foot as I ran to the cabin, though I cared little with sanctuary in sight. A light of hope shone through the trees, lots of them. The scout group had returned from their hike. I screamed, trying to call their names, but managing only incoherent crying and wailing. I recall being oddly amused in that moment, as I wondered if the voice was mine. The mind will do what it needs to survive, I suppose. Flashlight beams were directed my way, and the skittering steps behind me receded back into the blackness of the trees. Councillor Kerrigan ran to me, a look of confusion quickly eclipsed by true worry and fear as he saw me alone, cut to bits and fearing for my life. He ushered me to the cabin and asked everyone to remain in their dorms. "Go find Councillor Murphy," he told one of the more mature scouts. A response tumbles from my mouth unbidden. "Don't go into the woods." The fear in my words must have been palpable, as Councillor Kerrigan opted instead to have everyone stay indoors while he called the Gardaí. He tried to reassure me, distracting me with talk of finding my lost shoe when it was bright again. I would have limped home shoeless if it meant never having to go back into those woods again. I don't know how long the Gardaí took to arrive, but it was long enough for Jake to get restless. I suppose he didn't like the attention not only being on someone else, but being on the quietest reject in the school to boot. He began clowning around, asking the Gardaí obnoxious questions and generally being an insensitive, interfering fool. He got nasty, trying to claim I was trying to make everything about myself, and that I was the one who scared his sister on the hike with that stupid mask, he said. I was in no position to quiz him on what he was talking about, nor speak at all for that matter. I was catatonic, just doing what I could to hold it all together. I do remember his sister Breda looking deeply upset. Her friends gathered around her, trying to console her, along with her father, leaving me to be picked on by Jake. That is, right up until the moment he leaned out the back window to get a better look at the Gardaí as they searched the woods for anything pertinent. He leaned out, and as he did, he froze. His mischievous grin faded, his wide eyes seeming not to comprehend what it was that he was looking at. Slowly, he sat back down. He sat there for a moment, absorbed in thought, a disturbing behaviour for him by itself. He then simply ran to the fireplace and vomited. Some of the others asked if he was okay, asking what had happened, but they couldn't get it out of him. Not one word. He just shook his head and seemed to try to block everything out. Needless to say, I never went on another scouting trip. I gave up the scouts soon after, and was treated with a modicum of pity by all at school, and kept at arm's length. Nothing new. Jake was still nasty to me from time to time, but he seemed to always pipe down immediately after. Maybe the thoughts led to him recalling what he had seen at the back of the cabin that night. We never did find out what happened to Councillor Murphy, nor did I learn of what thing masqueraded as her, nor did I have the chance to ask Breda what it was that she had seen on the hike. For 2 decades and then some, I've sought to just move on, to forget it all. But yesterday I received a message on social media from none other than Jake Kerrigan. He was civil, friendly, and prefaced his message with a meek apology that he assured me would be more formal and comprehensive should we agree to meet in person. I read on, for the unexpected apology if nothing else. I would want to meet him in person, he assured me, once I heard him out. He referred to what we went through at Scouts, and how he wanted answers. For himself, for his sister Breda, and for the hard times he gave me over it unjustly. He had gone so far as to travel to the old cabin, now a moulded ruin in the mountains never used by anyone. He had investigated the area, looked for anything out of place that might point him in the right direction. He had been there for scarcely an hour and resolved to return at a later date to put his old scout skills to the test and explore properly. As he left, he saw something that had sent him speeding away from the area as soon as he could. He sent a picture of what he saw. Chills ran down my spine as I looked at the image, his words of questioning fading away to gibberish as my heart pounded as hard as it did when I ran away from the woods, away from that horrible thing back then. Placed neatly on the doorstep, bloated and covered in bog muck, was my shoe. The image of the shoe I had lost those many years ago chilled my blood. It was left there on the step of the cabin, as if it were a mere gift, an invitation. "You forgot this?" it seemed to say, mocking me, goading me into going back. It was remarkably well kept despite the passage of time, as if it had been pulled free from the muck and lovingly kept aside from me for all these years. The thought sent me right back to that horrible place in the woods, to that cold, muddy clearing where the thing that wasn't Councillor Murphy chased me to the edge of my sanity. I could feel the ice-cold muck around my foot again, pulling me down as I frantically attempted to escape, like an animal in a trap. A part of my innocence was left behind in that clearing, along with that shoe. Places of wonder in the world did not call to me since that day. Forests and mountains, rivers and seas, none held the promise of adventure and escape from mundane reality. All were dark houses to me, where vile, twisted things lay waiting, far from the light and warmth of civilization. Though the thing with too many joints never got me, part of me was killed within those black trees. It was sucked down into the muck and never pulled free, left to mummify until it remained as an infantile bog body, locked away from all light and wonder in the world. Instinct screamed at me to distance myself from it all, unless I wanted to be wounded in that way again. I took some time to compose myself as these memories hit me like a truck. It took no small measure of my willpower to lift my phone again and read Jake Kerrigan's message that accompanied the pictures. He had sent another message in the time I needed to calm down. He must have known I would want to block him forever. The message read,
"Look, I know I was an absolute prick to you. To be honest, I've been eaten by guilt these past few years when I think back on it all. I completely understand if you don't ever want to give me the time of day, but I need someone to talk to myself. I've talked to others, but they don't get it. They just remember it as some dramatic thing that happened at Scouts. They weren't affected by it enough, but we were. Rita just shuts down when I bring it up. Please just give me a chance. I need answers. And respectfully, I think you need them too."
He was, of course, completely right. Despite not wishing to ever speak about the incident again, it had been hanging over me for all of these years, always there in the back of my mind, in my dreams, and leering at me from the woods, of which there are too damn many everywhere I look. I had to see him. We met the next day for a quiet pint at the pub where Jake worked. It was an old man's pub, fit for a handful of select locals who practically lived there, with the occasional sports event. It was well before opening time, but Jake was the manager and exercised his position to let me in. He poured some complimentary pints and asked me how I was. Despite our past animosity, we chatted as if we were old friends. Time and trauma make excellent mortar for mutual respect, it seemed. Awkward pauses became frequent as the pints of stout settled. He fidgeted, filling the silence with mutterings of,
"Sure look."
the timeless silence filler of Irish conversation. He drank the stout before it settled. A barman would never. He was clearly occupying his mouth with drink rather than with the words needed to address the elephant in the room, so I decided to break the ice. Why does Breda shut down when you bring it up to her? He took a moment to respond.
Well, she has her own kids now. I suppose she doesn't like anything related to what happened to us being near them. She's very picturesque, real social media mammy type now. She carried what she saw with her all these years, so my guess is that she's scared to death of her own kids carrying anything horrible like that.
What did she see, Jake?
Fuck.
He breathed as he reached beneath the bar and pulled out an old camcorder.
I was going through my old scout stuff in the attic, and I came across Breda's camera. I decided to swap the batteries and look at the footage, see if there was anything Breda wanted to keep before the camera got damaged or whatever. I'm about to show you what Breda saw.
A chill ran down my spine at the prospect of seeing something that I had only seen in my nightmares for so many years. Did she see what I saw? Did she see something like it?
I knew in my gut that she saw something. I asked her to see it, but like I said, she always shuts down. The camera went missing and I thought she threw it out. I didn't have the heart to pursue it any further. I wanted to forget it and move on. We all did. Dad included.
Jake powered the camera on and selected the video clip. Wordlessly I watched him, too frozen with fear and curiosity to ask him to wait. Grainy footage played on the tiny LCD screen, a noisy black screen broken up by occasional flashlight beams and childish faces. Breda and her friends were chatting away, excited but spooked to be in such an unsettling place in each other's company. Breda stopped to tie her laces.
Wait for me, stop!
She leaned down, setting the camera and light to face her shoe while she tied her laces. Heavy seconds passed as the woods were visible behind her. I expected to see something, and my heart almost leapt as the visual grain instilled a sense of pareidolia in me, frightened of faces that weren't there. Her laces tied, she picked up the camera and light and made to catch up with the group. Then the microphone picked up a sound nearby. Tree branches snapping underfoot. Breda whirled around, commanding her friends to come out and stop scaring her.
Lads, will you stop? I don't like it anymore. Shannon, I can see your head.
My stomach lurched. Behind a tree trunk, a pale forehead could be seen. As if in slow motion, a face slithered forth. Breda screamed so hard that the camera mic registered it as a shrill buzz. There wasn't much time to make out the thing's features. It didn't help that Jake had to set the camera down as his hand was shaking too much. He watched it as I did, a hand clasped over his mouth while his knee bounced nervously. What we did see was a serpentine neck, far too long, eyes, too many and too small, embedded in pallid flesh caked with dirt, matted black hair, much like the thing that chased me, and a wicked smile, as if Breda's scream was music to its ears. The rest of the clip consisted of Breda running to the group, frantically telling them about the face she saw, her friends consoling her, and promptly turning the camera off once the group began to make their way back to camp. Jake and I sat in silence for a long minute. Jake was the one to break this one.
Oh, I thought it was just a mask from the way Breda described it. I should have looked at the video years ago, but like I said, Breda would always shut down when I brought it up. I thought about looking for the camera myself, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I only managed to work up the courage after all these years, when I found it by accident.
Jake, I need to know, what was it that you saw out the cabin window? Jake's smile dropped slightly, and he slapped his hands on his lap, took a deep breath, and downed his pint. With a smack of satisfaction, he breathed the words,
Fuck.
and proceeded to fish some whiskey from the bar. He downed a shot and indicated the bottle. Work away. I poured one too and awaited his response.
So the Gardaí got there, and we're looking around the woods. No one told us anything. I was mad curious, and I suppose the mixed emotions got me all restless. Wasn't able to just sit still. When Dad told me not to bother them, it made me want to bother them more. Look, I'll hold my hands up and say I was a little shithead, but you'll be happy to know that what I saw put some manners on me.
He poured some more whiskey, his hands unsteady.
Around the back there was a wooden bunker for storing firewood. The Gardaí were combing through the woods, but I saw a few of them standing around the bunker. They were moving stuff. I thought it was lumps of firewood. One of the flashlight beams moved across the scene in the second that one of them held up a lump of firewood. Only it wasn't a lump of firewood. Fuck.
He downed his whiskey that he had intended on sipping, and with a fiery exhale, he looked down into his emptied glass, swilling around the last few drops. His voice burnt down to a whisper.
I saw Councillor Murphy looking right at me from the Gardaí's hands.
My stomach lurched as one of the age-old mysteries from that horrible night had finally been answered. Whatever it was that had taken the form of Councillor Murphy had clearly murdered her, stuffing her dismembered remains into the bunker.
I don't know if you know this, but the Scouts disbanded soon after all this happened. My dad couldn't hack it. Scouts kept him busy, kept him off the drink. So when the parents understandably didn't want to send their kids anymore, he really took it hard.
I'm sorry, Jake.
No, it was going to happen. And through no fault of any of us.
He moved seat across the table and looked at me levelly.
I've shown you what Breda saw. Now, I need to know what you saw.
There was a sternness in his eyes, a burning need to know what I saw. But it was not an unkind look. They were the eyes of someone who knew how much they didn't know. He continued.
I remember we left for the hike with Dad. You stayed behind with Councillor Murphy. By the time we got back, you were running from the woods, and the Gardaí were called. My side of it is that she was murdered. Dad showed me the newspaper clippings from when it happened. The Gardaí told him they reckon you made up a story to deal with surviving whoever attacked you and Councillor Murphy. Had to catch him during a particularly rough binge, and even then it took a lot of convincing to talk about. To this day, he still thinks the killer is out there. But he isn't really wrong, is he?
No, he isn't, I confirmed. So that's what the Gardaí thought of my answer, so? That I was making shit up just to cope? I scoffed and shook my head. I suppose I can't blame them. I wouldn't have believed me either. But the story I told them was true. Something wore the skin of Councillor Murphy and lured me to those woods while I was alone. I have no video to prove it, but I can tell you that it wasn't much different from the thing that Breda saw.
I believe you. I kept thinking about that day over and over again. I've lost sleep over it. What occurred to me, the firewood bunker. Did you notice that we never had to go there even once?
What do you mean?
All the firewood we needed for the bonfire was already stacked when we arrived. More than enough. So that we'd never have to go near the bunker.
Another chill ran down my spine as I realised the calculated malice at play. The thing planned it in advance.
Yeah, and it had an accomplice too, I reckon. Going by Breda's video.
I told him of my time in the clearing with the thing with too many joints, and the story it told me of the mound people in the brief time it wore the form of Councillor Murphy.
Mound people? So there could be even more. And we have an idea of how they think. Still don't know why they're doing what they do though. I'd call them animals. Animals could never understand us well enough to form a plan like that.
They've probably been doing it all this time. Who knows how many missing people were actually killed by them? A sullen silence hung over us as we dwelled on how many people might have suffered at the many-jointed hands of the mound people. How many children like us.
I want to kill them.
Jake said flatly. I looked up in surprise.
If you're wondering what my endgame here is, it's exactly that. I want to hunt them down and kill them. For the years of trauma they inflicted on us. For taking away my father's happiness. And to avenge the life of Councillor Murphy. I understand if you don't want to join me. This is my choice. I'd never expect you to up and leave your life to take care of this on my behalf.
I muttered some half-hearted apologies, my heart racing as I hummed and hawed at the possible reality of entering those dark trees once more. But as I spoke, my heart raced with a fire it had not felt in many years. I wanted to hurt them. I wanted to dislocate every joint they had in revenge for a childhood ruined. I could not stop myself blurting the words, Let's go. I've already called in sick to work. We leave first thing tomorrow morning. Jake pulled up in his car, headlights illuminating drops of ice-cold rain in the blue light of an overcast dawn. We had agreed to meet early. The journey to the mountains was quite a long drive, and we wanted as much daylight as we could get. He stepped out of the car, coffee in hand and oddly high-spirited.
Morning. I have a few prezzies for you.
He popped the boot open, and I laid my eyes on a small arsenal. A hunting rifle and a shotgun, surrounded by their respective ammunition, along with an assortment of knives and tools.
Used to go hunting with one of the lads before he went to prison. Said I'd look after everything for him. I'm sure he won't mind us putting him to good use while he's away. We are hunting after all. Sure, that's what they're there for.
I didn't want to ask any questions about Jake's prison friend, nor did I care to know in that moment. I now had what I didn't have as a child, the power to fight back. I nodded in silent approval, Jake mirroring my gesture with a relishing grin. We jumped in the car and went on our way. Our time on the motorway was spent catching up, asking each other about how our lives had gone, the banal icebreakers we had skipped as we got caught up in our plans. Work, family, some laughs about nostalgic moments from school. I had forgotten about the good moments, being so caught up in the bad. I wish we could have stayed chatting like that, but the dark mountains looming against the grey morning sky in the distance served as a constant reminder of what had to be done. I saw their valleys, running deep where the morning light couldn't reach. A chill ran down my spine despite the car's heat. I felt as if I was being watched from the sea of black trees covering the mountain's face, even from this distance. Jake pointed to a bag at my feet.
There's a laptop in the bag there. Can you fire it up? Need you to see a few things before you arrive. There's a folder on the desktop there. Go into it and have a look at the stuff inside.
I clicked into the folder, simply titled Scout Stuff. Within was a collection of files, images and PDFs of newspaper articles from online and scanned paper archives. Jake had organised them by date. I never would have thought he would have the capacity to bother, going by his past behaviours and schoolwork. This had evidently consumed him to the point he hyper-fixated on every detail of it all. The files listed missing person reports, starting from soon after our Scouts trip. The first, of course, was Councillor Murphy. After her were random people, hikers, campers and cyclists. Along with these reports were forum screenshots of people discussing urban legends, talking about all the missing people in the mountains. One user, Dilbrack05, stated they would investigate and record the whole thing. I grimaced as the next file was a missing persons report for one Dylan Bracken, 19. The final report was dated from just last month. All these years.
Yeah, they've been at it since the Scouts trip. I couldn't find much more from the early years. I reckon that we were unlucky enough to go on that trip at the same time those things appeared.
So where did they come from? There has to be some place they stay in the woods. Are there any caves in the mountains?
I looked it up there and there's only one, and it's tiny. Not to mention it's a good bit away from the cabin, and it's in the middle of a farmer's field. But that's the only one they know about.
So there could be more. Before long, we were winding our way through the mountain roads, heavy raindrops plunking into the windshield as they fell from low-hanging branches. I stared into the woods, my breaths running shallow as I dreaded to see anything staring back. My mind raced as I thought not only of the woods that now had us in its clutches, but of the caves that could be running deep beneath them. As we drove down a steep decline, the cabin loomed before us. Broken windows, black and grimy with age, nonsensical graffiti, porch fence splintered and damaged, a hole in the roof from a branch sent flying by the storms of years past. As Jake turned off his car, an eerie silence descended upon the valley. The diffused grey light from the overcast sky lent the scene a dreamlike atmosphere. I felt as if I was walking into one of my many nightmares all over again. That if I were to step into the impenetrable black of the cabin door, I would snap awake, heart pounding and drenched in cold sweat. Well, imagine how hard my heart pounded when a fox suddenly sprinted from the doorway, startling us both. Jake and I looked at each other and laughed at our utter loss of composure.
Keep running, you little bollocks, ya,
he shouted playfully after the fox. We retrieved 2 flashlights from the boot of the car and proceeded inside the cabin. At least I have a working light this time around. The air was a wild mix of mountain air cleansed by rain, and decades-old mould and wood rot. It wafted into our faces, accompanied by hints of an old fire. Grey light shone through the hole in the roof, drops of rain tumbling into the wreck of an old tent, now bloated and soaked. Our lights painted across old beer cans and bottles that dotted the floor. Whoever created this mess hadn't been here in years. Whether they left of their own accord, or were taken, remained to be seen. We explored the remainder of the cabin. Scenes of the Scouts' trip past played behind our eyes as we looked upon the dead spaces that were all that remained of them. The warped floorboards where sleeping bags were set. The corner where bags were stacked, stuffed with warm clothes and a dozen lovingly packed lunches. The fire, once intended to be roaring on those cold nights, now only a heap of damp soot and old twigs. Silence overtook us as we were lost in memory, wandering around and reminiscing. I drifted outside, not caring for the rain. Out the back I saw Jake standing by the shattered remains of the wood bunker. He stared down, eyes wide as he was lost in the horrible memory of what he saw inside it. I knew whose eyes stared back at him in his reverie. "Jake!" He shook his head and snapped to attention, seemingly glad of the interruption.
Sorry, so.
He paused to clap his hands.
Why don't you show me in the woods where the counsellor touched you?
Too soon. We both chuckled, half at his bad joke and half at the very fact that we felt like chuckling at all. We were both more nervous being here than either of us would care to admit. We put on light waterproof jackets, but with our hoods down. We needed to be alert. Jake took his hunting rifle, being the more experienced shot between the two of us, and gave me a shotgun. He showed me the basics on how to use it, but we agreed not to practice, for fear of giving away our presence. If our presence wasn't detected already. Steeling myself, I brought him uphill, toward the clearing where I was attacked. My heart began to pound, and I tried in vain to convince myself that it was just the uphill ascent. But the nearer I got, the more nauseous I felt, and the more my hands began to shake. Phantom stones dug into the sole of my foot as I remembered the cold road under my bare foot as I ran. My heart leapt into my chest as I almost stepped into the very patch of bog that ensnared me. We neared the clearing, and I saw it remained exactly as it was those many years ago. I scanned the scene for anything of note, and that's when the smell hit me. That awful reek, the very same that assailed my senses whenever that thing began to whet whatever depraved appetite it had. It was faint, however, carried on the breeze coming down from the hills. In case you're wondering, that's what it smells like, I told Jake, never taking my eyes off the woods. That smell is how you know the mask is slipping. That's what they really smell like. It was faint when it looked like Councillor Murphy, but when it showed its true form, it made me want to get sick.
Let's follow it, so. It'll regret smelling this bad if it leads us right to it. Lanky bastard.
We made our way uphill, eyes peeled and noses keen, as we begrudgingly followed the scent. We arrived at a large clearing. It was a patch of marshland, surrounded by trees. Large stones dotted the perimeter, with most sunken into the muck and covered in moss. They formed a perfect ring around the tree line. Any passerby might have missed them, so sunken into the ground they were. But they once might have stood taller. In the centre was a narrow crevice into the ground. It was a jagged maw in the earth, stone teeth covered by sticks and hanging moss. We barely noticed it but for the damp moss hanging lower, thanks to the rain, exposing the darkness beneath. We peeled the moss and sticks away, shining our light into the depths. The crevice curved away from the light's path, leaving us unsure of how deep it went.
I have just the thing for this. Let's head back to the car for a minute.
We returned shortly with some climbing equipment. Jake fastened the rope around one of the standing stones, tugging it taut until he was sure it would support us.
Rock, paper, scissors on who goes first?
He suggested with a nervous laugh. I offered to go first, seizing the rope before Jake could protest, and while my nerves were still steady. The cave was sloped, and so I was able to rappel down quite easily. It was difficult to focus with the foul smell that wafted up from the depths. I kept glancing downwards, trying to stay on guard should anything rush at me from the dark. I arrived at the bottom shortly. The cave had curved away from the entrance in a bend that prevented it from receiving any light. I stood guard, shining my light to aid Jake's descent, occasionally glancing behind me as the drips of cave water played tricks on my mind. Once Jake was on solid ground, we pressed further on into the cave. It wound a short way into the earth, going gently downwards until it opened up into a large cavern. The cavern was deeper than we could have anticipated. A ring of rocky ledge ran around it as far as we could see, with everything else being rocky abyss. Nearby us, we saw piles of detritus, bags, tents, ragged clothes dirtied with old muck and blood, the remains I could have left behind if I hadn't been fast enough those years ago. A camera lay among the pile, drenched from exposure to dripping cave water. I pried it open, hoping to learn more. The camera's innards were practically rusted shut, the green verdigris telling me of the memory card's fate.
That's probably our man Dylan Bracken. He said he was going to record his search.
Probably won't learn much from it. The SD card is just a sliver of rust now. Among the pile, we found more unusual items. A rusted plate of metal, rusted until it was practically crumbling, and some equally rusted hooks tied to an old frayed rope. The metal plate seemed to be armour, like a medieval knight's cuirass, but lighter and less clunky. I turned to Jake, intending to ask him what he thought of the pieces of junk, and my heart stopped dead. Coiled behind him was a serpentine bundle of pale flesh, a foul smile of black lips and rotten fangs, cloaked in matted black hair. Jake followed my gaze and immediately jumped forward, opting not to turn his head so as not to broadcast his jump, but the thing was too quick. It wrapped the stump of its tail around his legs, dragging him back and tripping him. He dropped his rifle in light, and was ensnared in a desperate grapple with the creature. I took aim with the shotgun, but their struggle was too chaotic, the cave too dark. The spread of the shotgun might have hit Jake. I attempted to close the distance for a point-blank shot, but Jake's discarded light illuminated something approaching from the cave depths. Something with too many joints rushing right towards me. I backed up in a frightful panic, stumbling on the detritus behind me as the patter of many hands slapped towards me. I managed to fire one well-placed shot into what might have been the creature's face. A splash of brackish blood sprayed across the cave floor, but the creature kept coming. I was knocked to the ground, a dozen hands scratching and slapping in a feverish frenzy at the meal that had been denied to them 2 decades ago. I punched, gouged, bit in a mindless bid to survive, my senses flooded with adrenaline and the stink of the thing's flesh. I reached around me as worm-fingered hands seized my throat, trying desperately to seize any piece of detritus that might be my salvation. My hands came to rest upon cold metal, flakes of rust. Blindly I swung it into the creature's mass, and the cave was filled with the twang of metal and the creature's mad screeching. It was a keening of pain and anger, an inhuman bawling that seemed to come from multiple phlegmy throats at once. I sucked down grateful lungfuls of foul air as the beast released me. Staggering to my feet, I readied the metal as a shield or a club, whichever was needed first. The thing writhed in agony, steam rising from a peculiar burn mark where the metal collided with its pallid flesh. The stink of burnt offal filled the cave. I realized the power I now held. I took up the roped iron python and threw it to Jake.
"Stab it with the iron! The iron hurts them!"
I prayed he heard me during his struggle. I had to focus on charging the thing in front of me. I ran at it, slamming the metal into the meat of its body, pounding severe burns into its body where I hit it, and sending severe inflamed sores across its skin where I grazed it. I lost control. I hammered it into the cave floor, branding it with my anger over and over again for a childhood robbed. Before long, it was reduced to a pile of sizzling flesh. My hands shook, covered in brackish blood and flakes of rust. I would need a tetanus shot, but I can assure you, it was worth it. I looked to Jake and saw him dishing out similar punishment. He had gouged a gaping series of wounds into the thing's serpentine neck, and now straddled it as it tried desperately to squirm away. Over and over he stabbed, working his way up until its head remained. Clearly, he didn't want it to die too fast.
"This is for Breda, you fucking scumbag!"
I couldn't help but laugh as he silenced the thing's screams forever. He uttered the words as if it were some boy that broke Breda's heart, rather than some otherworldly monstrosity. The elation of my own triumph, and the juxtaposition of his words against what we faced sent me into a breathless laughing fit. Once he caught his own breath, Jake did the same. There in the darkness of the cavern, lying among our childhood enemies now broken and slain, we reclaimed at least some of the innocence we had lost. We left the cavern and alerted the local authorities of its presence. We cited it as being deep and somewhat hidden, and that hikers or children might get trapped or injured because of it. It wasn't long before they put up a metal fence around it, topped with spikes. We didn't know how deep the cavern went, or if there were other entrances, or other creatures. For now, we hoped that the iron mixed within the steel fence would do as much as the ancient iron we had weaponized against the creatures, imprisoning the creatures within their cave. I may have set out looking for answers, but I suppose it was natural that I wouldn't find many. But I did find a sort of carefree joy as I destroyed the creature, a childish joy I haven't felt in decades. The forests and dark places of the world still fill me with a ghost of childhood fear, but now, they also fill me with excitement. I enjoy the fear. I enjoy the threats. And now, my fellow hunter and I will enjoy hunting more of them down.